Hello again, and welcome to the M&E Drop-In Podcast. I'm Scott Humphris, and I'll be hosting this episode. Today, we're joined by Dave Yeoman from Lindapter. Dave is very knowledgeable in the area of decking fixings, and Lindapter is a company which manufactures and distributes decking fixings throughout the construction industry. Decking profiles are obviously an area that M&E contractors, a substrate that M&E contractors are faced with quite regularly. And so we thought it would be a good opportunity to speak to somebody that knows a little bit about it. So welcome, Dave. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and so on.
Delighted to be here, Scott. Thanks for the invite. My name's Dave Yeoman. As you've pointed out, I work for Lindapter, and I've been with the business for about 3 years. My background more broadly has been in construction supply. So I've worked in construction supply for nearly 20 years. Worked for Hilti for some of that time, and in similar to yourselves, worked in first fix distribution as well as cold rolled steel, focused on purlins, SFS supply in addition. So taking it back to perhaps my early days in construction and Hilti more broadly, Hilti being a manufacturer of power tools but also fixings. That's probably the most relatable part of my early career in construction that is transferable to the M&E sector. And when I look at the range of products at that time that we were supplying, it was predominantly chemical anchors and mechanical anchors. I worked as a generalist while I was there, which meant that I dealt with all trades at that time. And if we consider, say, mechanical anchors, which probably the most relevant to M&E, and we look at those products, I guess at that time we were focused on BS.08, being the part of the legislation and guidance that relates to the installation of post-installed mechanical anchors. So when we were going out, we were talking to contractors specifically. What we were talking to them about is making sure that they followed that code of practice. Principally, the guidance being that you should be using anchors that are appropriate for the particular substrate that you're fixing into. Especially in way of, at that point, safety critical anchors. So it was very important to use a fully tested anchor for a safety critical application, and making sure that you are selecting the right anchor for the right application in question. So, which is still very much relevant today as things have moved on significantly within construction themselves. And at Lindapter, we are focused on primarily clamped solutions into construction. With regards to MEP, our biggest product that we sell into MEP is the decking wedge, which is obviously what we're here to talk about today.
Most people should be quite familiar with the decking wedges. So that's great that we've got you here. Great to hear about your experience in the industry. Clearly, you've been in the construction industry and M&E you're familiar with for quite a long time. So it's great to have you here. You touched on there a little bit about BS.8539 and that's obviously something which has been around since 2012 and a very important standard certainly for our audience, for the M&E audience, because majority of services that are installed have to be fixed or suspended somehow, which require an anchoring to a substrate. So very important regulation, or not a regulation because it's a code of practice essentially, but it's a very important one for the industry and really the only one that we have that relates to decking fixings. The point I was going to make on that's been around since 2012, and it took quite a few years for the industry to really start paying attention to it. And I'd be pleased to say that over the last probably 4 or 5 years, that certainly started to change, and people are starting to pay much more attention to it, which is fantastic because it puts things in a very structured format, which if you follow, can save you a lot of. It's the right way to do it, but also can save you a lot of costs further down the road, which is great. So. That's sort of touching on how things can take quite a period of time for the industry to get used to something. Now, fast forward to 2022, the Building Safety Act, which is something which no doubt most of the audience will have heard of quite a few times now. This is something which, it came in 2022, 2024, then it became imprinted in the regulations, and it's really starting to see the effects in the industry. What's your, how do you foresee how it's going to affect the industry, particularly M&E and so on, and from your experience in the decking profile area?
Sure. Okay. So if we go back to BS.8539, and I would say specifically with regards to our decking wedges, conveniently one that I have here on the table, BS 539 is the code of practice that relates specifically to post-installed anchors.
Yep.
So we're slightly outside of that, but really the principles going back to that point kind of apply to decking fixings as well. So BS 539, you should be using anchors that have ETA's, European Technical Assessments.
Yes, yep.
Our products and our decking wedges have ETAs applied, so we have that. We also have approvals relating to the product. They're all CE marked by way of example. So we certainly fulfill that basic requirement as it related to BS 539.
Yes, so the principles from BS 539 essentially, whilst it's not a direct correlation to the same product, it's still an anchor, and you can apply some of those principles, is what you're saying.
Yes, it's certainly transferable between the two. But as we know, things have moved on markedly as a consequence of the Hackett Report, as a consequence of the Building Safety Act. And primarily the way that we interpret Building Safety Act is it's about illustrating compliance and competence through the golden thread of information on any construction project. And that is the core challenge for everybody really within the industry. So it's not just contractors, but it's all the stakeholders, it's the suppliers like us, and how can we work within that compliant and competent structure. Now, as far as our products is concerned, and this goes for everybody else within the industry, is that certainly with Lindapter, we have compliant products. So we have those approvals, we have ETAs, as I say, that relate to BS 539. Competence is a more complicated thing for us to work out, because we can give the contractor awareness, but competence is built from skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours.
Yeah, correct. Yes,
so
well-known SCEB, as it's often called.
Correct. Yeah. So we can give them the knowledge to install our products correctly, but what we can't do, for example, is we can't affect their behaviour on site.
Yeah.
You know, we can't give them the experience as well. That's not part of our remit.
Yes, yeah.
But I think as things have marched on and we understand that awareness is absolutely key. And this is one of the reasons why obviously we want to work more closely with people like yourselves, because we have things where we're working specifically on enabling that contractor more easily to develop the awareness about correct installation of our product.
Yes.
That being the missing component as far as we're concerned.
That's great. It's really interesting. And I want to pick up on something you touched on there. So you mentioned, obviously, the SCEB and skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours. I attended the Building Safety Regulators Conference a couple of months ago, and one of the points that came out of that, which I thought was really interesting, was particularly about behaviours, which is a point that you touched on there, because behaviours it's a very individual thing, isn't it? And it's not something necessarily that you, ultimately an external organisation can impact too much, if that's an understandable way of putting it. So when it comes to, I guess this applies to the installation of any anchors, but in this case we're talking about decking fixings. When it comes to any installation, essentially, I suppose, there's a right way of doing things and a wrong way of doing things, and essentially the same applies with behaviours. There's a good way of behaving and there's a bad way of behaving. So what are some of the common bad ways of doing things that you've seen when it comes to the installation of decking fixings, for example? Okay.
Well, I guess you take it back to basics. So essentially, each of the different decking manufacturers has a pattern on the underside of the deck, which corresponds to the correct decking fix to be used, as it were. So firstly, we need to make sure, because if there's a problem with an anchor or there's a problem with our fixing, it's one of two things. It's either that the anchor, or in this case, the decking wedge, has been incorrectly selected for the decking in question, which doesn't happen too often, but it's a possibility. Or it's been incorrectly installed. So obviously, we want to try and avoid both those elements at all costs. Now, it's very simple, I think, really, to judge which decking is on site. It's easy for us to look at. Each of them have their own individual patterns. So we know just by looking directly up onto the underside of the substrate exactly which decking is in question. We can therefore select the correct decking fixing. Now, the majority of our decking fixings are two-component products. What we have is ultimately, you've got a locking plate here, which is this metal piece. And then we have a casting as well that sits within that locking plate.
Wedge,
Okay. So from an installation perspective, we need to make sure that these are correctly orientated within the underside of the deck. Now, in every single decking, we have what we would call a re-entrant channel, which is exactly where this sits within the underside of the decking itself.
The channel that the wedge goes into,
So, for example, And really they all work in the same way, is that this piece, the casting piece, will sit inside the decking, rotate it through 90 degrees, and then it's locking itself in place. But the locking plate sits over the top of that, and then that just stops it rotating out of the decking.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what holds it in place.
Yeah.
Now, critically, you then need to use a nut and a washer and tighten that up with a correctly calibrated torque wrench.
Yes.
And from a torque perspective, it only requires 10 Newton meters torque to set correctly in the majority of cases.
Really, it's not very much,
which is not very much, yeah. So what we do find is that if people don't follow that particular guidance, and I think it's probably sort of human nature to assume that tighter is better, which is certainly not the case with regards to our products. Because if you keep tightening and you tighten that nut and you keep going, you keep going, you keep going, you keep going, then what happens is actually you will end up ultimately cracking that casting.
Yes, okay.
Which ultimately means that the anchor is essentially not fit for purpose at that point. Yeah. Now, it's quite difficult to do that, but we have seen examples of that happening. And that's really because, in reality, what 10 Newton meters torque looks like is finger tight on the nut, and then about half to 3/4 turn on the torque wrench before it's set.
Yes.
So it's quite a modest amount of torque.
Yeah, okay.
So that's a significant issue, shall we say? Yeah. Not an issue, but it's something that they need to be aware of.
Yeah, and really important one, because it's a very, I guess it's probably a bit of an age-old mindset, the tighter the better. And we see a lot in anchors overall, or even it could be the way channel systems are being built, for example, these joints and connections to different structures or to different substrates. There's a point at which overdoing the torque on the anchor can overcome the performance of the product. So it's really good that you've touched on that.
Yeah, 100%.
Is there another example you're going to
I mean, the other thing is that they are designed for static loads.
Yes.
Principally.
Okay.
So it's not really designed for a dynamic load. And so ultimately, if you have a rod drop from the underside of this, say a meter drop pulling down, if you rock that rod back and forth, you will most likely eject the fixing from within the reentrant.
Yes.
Now, for whatever reason, again, people tend to sort of do that and go, hang on, if I do it. But ultimately, if you were to do that with any particular anchor, it would have the same result. And that's because it's designed for a static load.
Yes, yeah.
And in reality, your building services that are hanging from the underside of the decking wedge will not be rocking back and forth. And if they are rocking back and forth to that extent, you would have more of an issue than the decking fixing primarily. But that's not a problem necessarily with installation. It's just because people don't necessarily understand exactly how these things work and how they're designed.
Yes, yeah, okay. So what can be done where people may be in a situation where during the construction process of the building, the anchor, the decking fixing, probably is going to have a dynamic load applied to it with something, for example, like cable pulling. Now, is that something which, in the design stage, these things need to be thought about? Where is there more anchor points you need and things like that? How can that be overcome?
Well, I would say 100%, Scott, because you hit the nail on the head, and that obviously a cable pull is happening in a huge majority of cases on site. It's not something that we necessarily get involved with, other than to prescribe exactly what you said there, is that needs to be taken into account. Yeah. You most likely need to have some kind of bracing point at different points within your structure to ensure that it is capable of hitting that dynamic load as it's being pulled through. Yeah. So again, that comes really back to the design stage and making sure that that's accommodated at that particular juncture.
Good, yeah. It's like most things. It's about that early engagement and thinking about these things in the design stage, rather than, I need some decking fixings on site tomorrow. I'll have these ones, and they turn up on site. There's been zero specification process there. So sure. That's really interesting. Yeah, we've talked about you touched early on a little bit about the selection process, and we've talked about the design stage. But ultimately, who should be the specifier of a decking fixing, do you think?
So, Scott, I would say more broadly, it's about looking at the selection process as a whole. Certainly, whether you have the peace of mind with our product that we have a compliant solution. Yep. And it's also important to consider the benefits as to why you would use a decking fixing as opposed to actually using a post-installed anchor. One of the biggest benefits, particularly in recent years, and a lot of the main contractors are very switched on to this, is limiting dust exposure on site.
Okay.
Big problem of installing in decking is obviously you're drilling above, and the dust will immediately fall out
down on
top of the operative, which is a significant issue. And silica dust is a potential carcinogen, which is why the main contractors are so interested in avoiding that at all costs.
Absolutely, yeah.
The benefit of having a wedge means that we're going into that. There's no drilling. It can be hand-tooled installed as well, so you don't need
So effectively, it's a dustless installation.
It's a completely dustless installation. The second thing is the speed of installation as well. Because you're not having to drill, you're using a power tool, you're drilling, you're also then having to install an anchor after the fact, and you're using hand tools. It can be at least 2 times as fast as installing a post-installed anchor. So really, when you're talking about a large job, the savings in terms of labour can be vast.
Yeah, particularly when you've got a metal deck. I mean, you've got to, if you're going to install a post-installed anchor into the concrete, you've got to penetrate the metal and the concrete, which adds to your installation time effectively, doesn't it?
Correct. I mean, the other thing about the metal deck as well, which a lot of people don't consider or think about, is that technically if you are drilling the underside of the deck, you should be seeking permission of an engineer to allow for the drilling of the deck from a fire performance perspective.
So if somebody does drill a deck, potentially they could be impacted the fire performance of it.
Yes.
That's what you're saying, eh?
Yeah, that's correct. The other concern is that when you're drilling and making penetrations into the underside of the deck, you can cause delamination, which means that the deck actually pulls away from the concrete itself. Again, that can affect the overall fire performance and the integrity of the deck itself. And our system doesn't involve delamination of the deck in any capacity either. Okay,
that's an important point you raised there, Dave, about thinking about it as part of the system. And I think that's something that would be good to touch on. Going back to Hackett report was obviously quite an important point about not just considering things as individual components, but think about how they come together as a system. What could you say about that?
Yeah, you're 100% right, Scott. I would say if we're looking at decking wedges in isolation, it's there to hang something. And ultimately, for example, Midfix are supplying the full support system. And really, from our perspective as a manufacturer, it'd be no good if you're hanging a system that is just not compliant and not conformant, really, because if there's a problem, that affects all of us in many regards. And as you quite rightly pointed out from the Hackett report, it's about using approved and applied systems.
Yeah.
So we at Lindapter, we recognise that that's important, that we work with people that are able to provide the full system to the customer, because we are essentially applying or supplying, I should say, one particular component. Yeah. So it is very important to us as a manufacturer as well.
Yeah, and the anchor essentially makes it one of the most important parts of the system because it's usually the weakest point.
Correct, yes, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, yeah, another thing I wanted to ask you, Dave, and I think it's something which probably a lot of people wonder whenever they see decking profiles. They always seem to have different patterns on the side of them. Where do those patterns come from? Who comes up with them? What are they for?
Very good point, yeah, and something we don't often discuss. So as far as the decking is concerned, we have various different decking manufacturers in the UK specifically, and they all supply decking really that has a re-entrant channel that we can fix our products into. So it's quite rare that we have somebody that's supplying a decking that we can't actually supply a decking fixing into. Yeah. Now, as far as the decking manufacturers, the way that works within construction themselves is that they are selling that decking generally to the primary frame contractor, so whoever's doing the primary frame steel frame. On the site. So they will actually supply a certain square meterage of decking for a particular job. And each of the manufacturers have their own patterning on the decking themselves. So that would typically take what that would look like, either a sort of dots pattern, sequential dots, or sort of dashes in a particular orientation. But they are quite clear and quite distinct, and that allows us to be able to identify which decking manufacturer has been used, and obviously which decking, and accordingly which decking wedge to use on site. Okay, interesting, yeah. So when it comes to engaging early, getting the specification process up and running, that is probably one of the key stages. Take a picture of the decking profile, the pattern on the side of it, and then that helps the specifier then identify which may be the correct anchor for that installation. Would I be right in saying, Dave, that for each, just because there's a particular pattern doesn't mean there's just any one anchor that may
suit that. There could be multiple anchors. Am I correct in understanding that? Or?
It tends to be very specific to the deck itself. There are certain patterns that look similar-ish. So if there's any confusion, you can always check with Lindapter. That's not a problem. The easiest way for us to tell would be to take an image directly from beneath, so not at an angle, because some of the patterns have lines at different angles. If you take it at an angle, it can be difficult to identify. But if you take it directly from underneath, looking directly up, that's the best way for us to identify the decking. And obviously within our brochure on our website, you can easily see what the decking patterns are and then match that accordingly to the fixing. But if there is any doubt whatsoever, then it's very easy to speak to us and we can identify that for you.
Yeah, that's good. That's really useful for contractors to know. So just moving on from that then, obviously, you provide a lot of these decking fixings into the construction industry. You probably get to see some quite unique and interesting applications where they're used. Mm-hmm. Have you got any recent examples of projects where a Lindapter decking fixing has been used where it might have overcome a particular challenge, or is it used in a particular way where it was there to overcome a problem or something like that?
So I guess we touched on it earlier, Scott, that from our perspective, the speed of installation is quite significant. Yeah. So there's a significant difference between installing that and a post-installed concrete anchor. Yeah. So if I was to give a recent example more generally, they've been extensively used in a lot of the Amazon warehouses that were constructed maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah. They have started to construct again. We've got a couple of existing examples of sites where we're seeing big Amazons going up. Yeah. Now, we would describe those as large portal frames or large sheds, and typically they don't tend to have much decking in them. But actually the thing about the Amazons is they have floors running through these buildings, and they're vast in terms of the overall footprint of the building. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of decking within them and a lot of services that pass through the building. So it's very important that they use a solution that is quick to install. Yeah. So hence using our decking fixings for the installation in a lot of cases on those projects. Okay, yeah, so it comes back to that speed of installation that you were saying earlier. Okay, that's interesting. Another talking point I wanted to bring up here. So for construction tends to be a bit more of a challenging one when it comes to sustainability. So construction's obviously become well publicised that it's one of the biggest contributors of embodied carbon and so on, and you can understand why, because if you consider the amount of raw materials and so on that go into the entire construction process, it's a very, very deep and expansive supply chain. So what's your thoughts on the point of sustainability, and is there anything that Lindapter is doing specifically that helping address it, or that contractors can gain from using Lindapter decking fixings? Mm-hmm. So I guess more broadly, all of our products are made from steel. Okay. And steel being eminently recyclable. So the significant benefit being that if we look at what's happening with the green agenda and we look at, say, design for deconstruction, which is often now being driven client side, so we're seeing an element of that coming within the industry. Okay. The point of design for deconstruction is, again, it's about early engagement. Yeah. It must be designed from the start with deconstruction in mind. And really, when we look at deconstruction, what does that mean? Well, that means breaking the building down into its constituent parts and either reusing those parts or recycling them. Now, if we look at any particular building, there are certain components within that building that can be recycled. There are components that can't. So obviously you couldn't recycle the cabling that's passing through a building that's maybe 30, 40 years old. You couldn't recycle the drywall that's passing through that building. But the steel elements are more readily recyclable. So if we look at the main steel elements of the building, so the primary frame of the building, certainly that can be repurposed with those with large steelwork or recycled. And that applies to our product as well. So being made of steel, those products can be recycled. And more broadly, it is obviously a significant issue right the way through the industry. So it's something that we do have at the front of our minds to make sure that we are working on solutions that are environmentally friendly as well. Yeah, okay. That's good. So key points there, it's recyclability and sort of designing for deconstruction. But yeah, as you rightly say, it's a challenge that I'd say the entire industry, supply chain included, is having to have a good hard think about, because it's not a straightforward one, and whenever you take you've got the industry's trying to do on the fire regulation side of it, and when it comes to sustainability, the two don't always
can't always align, and you have to find ways of working around that. So that's good. Thanks for touching on that. So we've touched previously on some of the regulations. We spoke about the Code of Practice based out of Iran, spoken about the Building Safety Act. We've touched on things like Golden Thread. Is there any upcoming changes or regulations that you think are going to further affect the industry?
So I think we really need to focus, as you say, about Building Safety Act and that compliance and competence element to the golden thread of information. I think that is going to stay with us without shadow of a doubt. And the sort of rigors of managing that are only going to increase for contractors on site.
Yeah.
So it's really going to be, how do these people evidence the use of correct installation, of being competent and being compliant, using compliant solutions on site.
Yeah.
So as we discussed, we have compliant solutions. We can help in terms of awareness, and we're working with the likes of you, particularly on the awareness element. We've got something exciting coming up with yourselves as far as awareness is concerned.
Yeah.
And I certainly think from the industry's perspective, the digitization of the compliance and the competence side of things is going to become more and more relevant.
Yes. Sure,
and how, as an industry, we package that information through the golden thread of information to illustrate that everything has been done in accordance and correctly. So I think that is going to become increasingly more and more important. And it's something certainly we've got top of mind to think about ways that we can help people to illustrate compliance with regards to Lindapter products in the future.
Yeah, no, that's really good. No, it's good you touched on there what we've been working on in terms of helping people with the awareness side of things. I mean, it comes back really to the skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours you spoke about earlier. And the importance of training essentially is kind of what it comes down to. And this is something that obviously Lindapter and Midfix have been working together on over the last few months, and hopefully in the not too distant future we'll be able to put a training course out there specific to decking fixings, which I think should be really useful. But yeah, just coming back to that point on compliance, this will certainly help you towards compliance and competence. When it comes to competence, it's not going to make you competent; it'll help you towards it, because, like I said earlier, it's that knowledge part, isn't it? So it's a really important point to know, because I think as an industry we're quite good at looking for tick box solutions, and when it comes to the requirements that the regulations may be asking of us, is there a quick tick box exercise that we can do that'll help us move on to the next thing? But it comes back to behaviours, doesn't it?
Yes, 100%.
So it's about keeping that forefront. Okay.
Well, we try and make it as simple, I guess, for the contractor as possible in way of installation. All of our products come with installation cards that show very clearly and concisely how to install the product. And I just think, I suppose there's been an element of neglect of that right across the industry in the past. So we need ways of trying to communicate as effectively, as quickly, as concisely how to install things correctly on site. And I think, again, digitization is going to help significantly in the future with that as well. That's
interesting, Dave. And obviously you touched on their digitization, and it's good to see with training that that it's moving more towards, an online medium to deliver training. Historically, it's been very much the traditional way of doing it in this industry has been toolbox talks. What's your thoughts on that?
So we do conduct toolbox talks. I was actually conducting one yesterday, would you believe it, on site, just showing the correct installation.
How did that
go? It was good. I had a room of about 30, 40 guys, solemn-faced guys, but I think it was broadly well received. So we have the capability to do that, but I guess ultimately we're a team in the UK of sales engineers such as myself. There are 5 of us. So we certainly can't get around every single decking site that's using our material on a daily basis, daily, weekly basis. It's not possible for us to do. So, and I think that's the way the industry is moving. And that's something, for example, that we've discussed with yourselves is online training, looking at that as a component. Very simple to do, very simple to look at a video, sit a course, very repeatable.
And trackable.
Yes, definitely on site. So these are the sorts of things that we're considering very much as being critical for the future.
That's good. So that's a really good example of where technology can start to play a part in helping the construction process. And it is obviously something we're starting to see more and more in the industry. I think another good example that we've been fortunate to be involved in recently is development of an online configurator for support bracketry, and it really speaks to the point we were talking about earlier, where you've got different components coming together as a system. Well, in the configurator, it's not actually just about the channel system, but it's also about how it's connected to the substrate. Mm-hmm. And one of the examples that we use in our configurator is the Lindapter decking fixings, because it's such a common decking profiles are such a common substrate that people come up against. So that's another example there of how technology can play a part in the construction process. Another thing I wanted to touch on with you, Dave, is testing. Essentially, it's something we see come up quite a bit. People requesting, I need a pull test to, demonstrate that this anchor's going to work. What's your thoughts on that?
So certainly we would say that provided you've selected the correct decking wedge for the correct substrate and it's been installed correctly to 10 Newton meters torque, there should be no issue, and there should be no requirement necessarily for testing. Having said that, that is something that we can offer. So we can do a proof load test on site if somebody asks for it specifically. We'll come to site and test a specific fixing or a couple of fixings on site, perhaps in 2 different locations. We will test to the safe working load, which in the majority of cases on our fixings is 1.47 kilonewtons, which has a factor of safety of 3 to 1. And we'll just check that it was capable of holding the safe working load. And then we'll produce a certificate to the effect of the fact that we've been to site, we've done a proof load test, and here is the evidence to show that that is more than capable of holding the safe working load. But I must reiterate that provided you're selecting the correct wedge for the correct decking, it shouldn't be an issue.
Okay, so what you're saying is, yes, it can be done, and it is a service that you offer, but technically you shouldn't actually need it if the selection process has been followed correctly. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I think
is that because it's an ETA anchor which has gone through the ETA process? Dare I say, a very costly process.
Yes.
A lot of testing has happened in that ETA process.
Yes.
So essentially, if you're doing it again on site, you're replicating that. Now, when it comes to decking profiles and a decking fixing, the variables are actually very limited, aren't they? Because the fixing matches the deck. Essentially, it's not like whenever you're fixing to a hollow pot or something like that. You've got a few different variables there. You might not know the performance of the substrate. When it comes to a post-installed anchor, that's different, where you may require some more complex testing to help the specification process. But when it comes to decking fixings, a lot of that has already happened in the ETA process. Is that?
That's 100% correct, Scott. And I would say, but if anybody does have any concerns about decking fixings on site, then please pick up the phone, because we're quite happy to come and look. And the first thing that we would do, if there are concerns about the decking itself, because it really would relate to the decking, is we would check the dimensions of the re-entrant channel itself and make sure it falls within the confines of exactly what we would stipulate it needs to be. But it's very, very rare that there would be any issue in that nature. I suppose any other issue...
So there can be some variables that you have to pay attention to.
If, for example, there's a very wide span of deck, and perhaps they've poured more concrete than they necessarily should for the gauge of the decking, you could get significant bowing of the deck.
So how would that affect the...
Well, that potentially would push the re-entrant channel out of alignment, because it would open up slightly. But again, that's very, very rare, and obviously that's down to perhaps incorrect engineering of the decking to begin with.
Thanks, Dave. That's been really interesting and very educational and informative, and hopefully the audience will also find it to be very useful as well. Bit of a parting question we usually ask most guests. What's one thing you'd change about the industry?
Very good question, that, Scott. I would say, well, from my own personal experience, we invest a lot of time trying to cover off projects, so we're aware of projects as and when they emerge. And I think what we would like as a supplier is early engagement as much as possible with different stakeholders right the way through a construction job. Because if the engagement is early enough, I feel that's when we can have the most impact. And by perhaps looking at a project in its entirety and looking where we can add value, so to speak. And specifically decking wedges, it's kind of like, look, if you've got a substrate where you can use this, we can save you a lot of time. And it's specifically with fixings, they are a bit of an afterthought.
Yes,
it's almost like you turn up on site and then you think, right, we've got to fix this. What do we do? And I think those decisions are much better made much earlier on in the construction phase.
Yeah, I completely agree, Dave. I think that's something that the industry is probably finding, perhaps learning the hard way. Early engagement ends up being the root of least resistance. Might not seem like it from the outset. So definitely collaboration, early engagement. I think that's a fantastic point to end on. So thanks for coming, Dave. It's been great having you here, and you're welcome back anytime. And looking forward to continuing this collaboration, and hopefully the training course the audience should see published soon. Thanks for that, and thanks for those listening, and feel free to check out the previous episodes and more upcoming episodes in the not too distant future. Thank you. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks very much.